And we are live on YouTube. So those of you who want can perhaps distribute the link further on social media. Claudia will put the link in the chat. Here is the link, and you can distribute it further. Right, and being 3 minutes past, let's try to begin. So welcome everyone to the Princeton-Bucharest Seminar Online edition, episode 64. Tonight we have a panel entitled Some Relations of the Mind in Malebranche with 3 speakers. We will have questions at the end. And our first speaker is Julie Walsh. Her talk is entitled Malebranche on What We Owe to Each Other. Julie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. So the title of my talk is inspired not by Scanlan, but by Treatise. Any Good Place fans out there? Anyone? No? Okay. And I'll just, before getting going, I want to just note that the 3 of us are going to be talking about different themes in Malebranche, but our hope is that the themes of love and the themes of other people will sort of run through the 3 talks. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up some slides, and I'll get going here. Okay, so love is a central theme in Malebranche's philosophical system. He describes the motivation for all human action as deriving from the love of the good in general, which is to say God. This love of the good in general is instantiated in everyday life by our pursuit of things that we perceive as pleasurable and our avoidance of things that we perceive as painful. In short, Malebranche is a hedonist about human action. He devotes an entire book, the Treatise on the Love of God, to explaining how he understands the compatibility of his commitment to hedonism with his commitment to the injunction to only love God for himself and not because loving God causes pleasure. Across many of his other texts, Malebranche describes sin as the mistaken belief that finite objects are the appropriate objects of our love. Malebranche's hedonism and the difficulty of reconciling it with the kind of love appropriate for God have received attention, lots of attention in the secondary literature. But there's one facet of Malebranche's view on love that has not been widely discussed: his endorsement of the commandment to love your neighbor, which he characterizes as a duty. When we attend to the manner in which Malebranche thinks we have to fulfill the duty to love our neighbor, an inconsistency arises. Loving our neighbor for Malebranche requires more than merely holding positive attitudes about them. It requires action in the form of conversation, socialization. But Malebranche also cautions us against performing actions of precisely this sort. He goes on at length about the dangers associated with congress with other people because of the contagious nature of their disordered minds. This inconsistency raises the question of how Malebranche thinks we can fulfill the duty to actively love our neighbors while not risking contamination from their disordered minds. In short, according to Malebranche, what do we owe each other? So it's my aim here to try to sketch an answer to that question. So I will talk through 3 sections today. First, I want to show how Malebranche motivates the duty to love your neighbor. This will involve some discussion of the role that Christ plays in human life, both in the terrestrial and the celestial plane. Second, I will go through the reason why Malebranche thinks that interpersonal relationships can be dangerous. And there I focus on Malebranche's recommendations for using reason well and becoming close to God, and how this practice is incompatible or seems incompatible with socialization. And then in section 3, I describe what I take to be the practice of love that Malebranche thinks characterizes the appropriate love of our neighbor. I suggest that the risks associated with loving our neighbor are worth it for Malebranche because loving our neighbor helps us too. And it's actually the only reason why we're here. So that's the general arc. So a preliminary point before moving to section 1. Malebranche is careful to distinguish among 3 different meanings of to love. So we have the love of union, which is where we willingly unite ourselves to an object as though it represents our good or is the cause of our happiness. And the love of union is only appropriate with God. Second, we have the love of conformity. So to conform to the rule of the perfection of the object of love. And it is only appropriate, according to Malebranche, for us to love with conformity the immutable order. I'm not going to say anything more about the immutable order here, but for those who might be unfamiliar with his system, Malebranche, one way to think about the immutable order is sort of the order of perfection of things. And then finally, the love of benevolence or goodwill, which in the French is bienveillance, to wish for someone to be happy and to desire their perfection. This is the love we ought to have for our neighbor. So it's this sort of love that I'm really interested in here. And I think that these passages suggest that for Malebranche, to love your neighbor with goodwill is to actually promote loves of kinds 1 and 2 in them. So we want our neighbor to be happy. We want them to have the love of union. We desire their perfection. We want them to have the love of conformity. So I'll come back to this at the end of the presentation, or I'll sort of recap what I mean by this. Well, I hope to show what I've just said. So I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, so section 1. Why does Malebranche think we have a duty to love our neighbor? So Malebranche holds that we have an inclination to love our neighbor. And it is also a divinely commanded duty to love our neighbor. So he says, God has commanded us to have charity for one another, but self-love can sort of erode and eat away at charity, breaking the bonds of civil society. So God preserves the charity we have for each other by uniting us with natural ties. These natural ties, says Malebranche, consist in a certain disposition of the brain all men have to imitate those with whom they converse, to form the same judgments they make, and to share the same passions by which they are moved. So this ties us very closely together. And God has a really good reason. Well, God has good reasons for everything he does. But he has a good reason for tying us together in this way. The terrestrial community that we constitute on Earth is related in a really important way to the eternal community in the next life. Malebranche notes that the eternal society is the society that interests God, and indeed is the sole reason for his creation. Okay, so what does this mean? Malebranche tells us that God's plan in the terrestrial society is to furnish Christ, the architect of the eternal temple, with the materials he needs to form his church. So it's not possible that we would lack essential duties when entering into the plans of he who wants to save all men. We are to make use of all our powers to hasten his great work and procure for men the goods for which God has made them. There are 2 claims in this passage. First, Malebranche states that finite beings are created to provide Christ with the materials to build his temple. I'll say more about this in a moment. Second, given our role as potential materials for this celestial construction, we have a role to play in God's plan. So this, it seems, entails that we are obligated to fulfill certain duties in order to help realize God's plan. And these duties involve making sure that our neighbors have true goods, the goods for which God made them. These goods must be true and not perishable. And the way to detect which goods are true is to accurately distinguish between those that can be loved by reason and thus according to order, and those that are loved only by instinct. As it turns out, God alone is a true good, and it is an error to judge that any sensible good is true. So helping our neighbors recognize God alone as the true good is to contribute to God's plan for Christ. Okay, so what are the stakes involved in the proper execution of this duty to love our neighbor? What is the purpose of procuring goods for our neighbor? Malebranche's answer is that such procurement is essential for what I would call eternal world building. To be a member of the eternal society is to be chosen by Christ to be a stone in the construction of his temple. Malebranche says scripture teaches us that not only is Christ the head of the church, but he begets it. So how does this work? Malebranche explains that Christ's love for God and his zeal for building the most beautiful and adorned church possible entails that he ceaselessly desires to acquire the materials to build such a temple. Because Malebranche is an occasionalist, holding that God's volitions alone have causal efficacy, he holds that Christ's volitions in choosing his stones for this temple are no more than occasional causes. But Christ's volitions are special. Because God created the world with Christ's role as the architect of the temple in mind, he saw fit to make Christ's desires the occasional causes of the efficacy of the laws of grace. Malebranche supports this claim by telling us faith teaches that God gave Christ absolute power over human beings by making him the head of the church. An effect of this status is that his volitions, his desires, are always carried out. Christ merited this gift of absolute power, Malebranche says, by his sacrifice on the cross. So once Christ has been resurrected in full possession of this gift, he ceaselessly prays to his Father for men, and Christ's desires are always fulfilled according to the laws of grace. So his prayers for men are always answered. Okay, but how does this work? What's the mechanism? Malebranche says, okay, Christ, like any human being, has a succession of various thoughts in his mind. Unlike other human beings, Christ's thoughts are focused on the dispositions of which human souls are capable. So Malebranche says, here's how, at least I understand the mechanism. Christ thinks about the disposition of human souls, a particular disposition of human souls. Those thoughts are connected to desires that relate to the sanctification of human souls. These desires are the occasional causes of grace, and these occasional causes bestow grace on particular human beings with dispositions of the sort that Christ is currently considering. So this is a little bit convoluted. So there are two examples coming that might help. Okay, so here's the first. This is an analogy that is supposed to help explain this part of the view. Malebranche writes, when a person considers some part of his body which is not formed as it ought to be, he naturally has certain desires with respect to that part. And these desires are followed by certain insensible movements of the animal spirits. When the body is entirely formed and the flesh is too firm, these movements can change nothing in the structure of the parts. But when the body is not entirely formed and its flesh is soft and delicate, the movements which accompany the desires of the soul not only place certain particular dispositions in the body, they can even change its construction. So for any of you who are familiar with book 2 of Malebranche's Search After Truth, where he talks about the imagination, you might already be thinking about his incredibly I'll say interesting discussion of generation in utero. And I think Hans might say a little bit about this in his talk. So in this analogy, Christ's temple is like a fetus. His desires are connected to certain movements that do in fact have an effect on the body. The eternal temple is also known as the celestial body of Christ. As Malebranche says, the mystical body of Jesus Christ is not yet a perfect man. He will never be until the end of days. So currently we are living, and Malebranche took his own age to be similar to ours, and that we're living in a time of, forgive the extension of the metaphor, but we're living in a time of gestation. The body of Christ is still gestating. And so Christ's volitions and desires with respect to sanctification and saving certain kinds of human souls is still ongoing. So it currently still has effect. Okay, so if Christ's thoughts turn to sinners of a particular kind, those sinners will be given grace. Malebranche explains this by saying that Christ needs all kinds of souls for the temple. He may even need souls that have sinned and suffered consequent persecution, like incarceration, feelings of guilt, and so forth. This means that sinners might be saved if their souls match the kind of soul Christ needs at a particular moment. Malebranche appeals to another analogy to make this point. If an architect needs bricks of a certain shape and size to complete their building, they will be focused on that kind of stone. So if you need a cornerstone to get your building, set up in the right kind of way, you'll be focused on finding a cornerstone. In just the same way, Christ thinks about sinners if their souls are necessary for the construction of his mystical body. What this means for Malebranche is that Christ is indifferent to have Paul or John in his temple if one or the other of them is similar to the idea that determines Christ's desires. So Christ is indifferent to which particular individual becomes part of his temple, as long as their soul is disposed in the right way. But Malebranche is also clear that Christ tends to think more frequently of dispositions of a certain kind, the kind that are found in a mind that follows Christ's counsel. So Christ might think about a sinner, might think about somebody who feels guilty, might consider somebody who has dispositions to idolatry. But it's just a truth, according to Malebranche, that Christ is going to tend to dwell more frequently on minds that follow Christ's counsel. This is because Christ thinks more frequently about souls that will enter more easily into his architectural plan. And here's our third and final analogy. So we've had a fetus, we've had architect, and now we have a chef. Malebranche likens this to our tendency to eat things that are more easily digestible and avoid things that are not. So we ourselves want to be as digestible as possible for Christ. So executing our duty to love our neighbor involves helping our neighbor become the kind of stone, the kind of food that is appropriate to Christ's construction. Okay, but here's the problem. Procuring goods for our neighbor seems in tension with Malebranche's recommendation to avoid social interaction. So Malebranche repeats time and again across all of his works that we must mortify the flesh in order to become closer to God and to reason well. So here's just one representative passage. He says, even more, potentially more extreme, we have to quiet the senses to the extent that we become like the dead. And he adds that preserving the purity of the imagination is particularly important because people with pure imaginations and who resist their passions can discover countless truths. They leave the body when they draw near the truth. Being like the dead seems utterly incompatible with socializing. Malebranche writes that there is almost never anything to gain among men. Their language is corrupt, as is their heart. Their example, that is their behavior, is even more dangerous than their speech. This is dangerous because of how given we are to imitation. We mechanically do what others are doing, says Malebranche. This is a result of the natural ties that God instituted in us so that we might live together. So this raises a problem. How can we love our neighbor, procure goods for them in an effort to get them to become bricks in the eternal temple, while at the same time mortifying our senses and becoming like the dead? In other words, how do we reconcile the duty to love our neighbor with the dangers inherent in social interaction? So I think we can start to see an answer to this question by looking at the more practical recommendations that Malebranche offers for loving one's neighbor. So he says, we are obliged to use other men's concupiscence or self-love in order to moderate their passions. We ought to plant and water and to expect the increase in fruition from heaven. We ought to try to make the universal instrument of iniquity, the concupiscence of pride and of pleasures, to serve the good and alter self-love a bit, to win it over and govern it. And he's clear that no one is left behind in our execution of this duty, or to execute our duty properly, no one is left behind. We must not imagine that we must always perform more duties toward the just than towards sinners, to the faithful than to heretics, and even pagans. So Malebranche states that the bond between human beings is the most natural bond there is. As we know, it's instituted by God. But despite the naturalness of this bond, it has become more and more frequently the case that humans are motivated more to increase their own grandeur and to work together than to work together to mutually assure one another's salvation. Because of this, those among us who are able to pursue virtue must resort to a kind of trickery. And this is what I take the first passage to be indicating. So we need to sort of use people's self-love in order to bring them into line with flattery or sweet speech, false abasement. Reason on its own is not enough to persuade people. We need to use the charms of the body to do so. And I think what Malebranche is saying is that we need to walk a really thin line between reason and sensation. So we must use the bodily tools that we have to persuade people without being consumed by or lost in them. Malebranche is clear that the love that is our duty, the duty to love our neighbor, is not passive. It's not a wish. It's not a disposition to kindly regard our neighbors from afar, right? It's not like standing, a little bit away from a group and being like, oh, we wish them the best. I don't think it's a passive love. He says we ought to work with more ardor to get them to return than to conserve this miserable life. And I think that it's worth emphasizing that Malebranche thinks this love is expansive. Good people who are truly animated by charity never break with those who live in disorder. So everyone ought to be the target of our love. But cast in this way, the obligation to love your neighbor and what it entails seems all the more strange. Why would Malebranche enjoin us to risk our reason and truth in order to save our neighbor, and even worse, a heretic or a pagan? I think that Malebranche offers us two reasons, and maybe even good reasons, to take the risk. First, it helps us too. So Malebranche thinks that we should consider the salvation of our neighbors as a reward for us, for the services that we have rendered them. And we are also rewarded for our efforts, our glory. Second, and to me, more compelling, the commerce of the world ought to incline only toward establishing an eternal society in Jesus Christ. We ought to converse with other men only to work for their sanctification, so that they may work for ours. God has put us in this world only for this purpose. So let's go back to love by way of conclusion. Recall Malebranche's disambiguation that we canvassed at the outset. To love is equivocal, he said. It seems to me that for Malebranche, loving our neighbor is nothing more than promoting in them the other two kinds of love of union with God, which leads to happiness, and love of conformity with the immutable order of perfection. Failing to procure these goods for our neighbors is a twofold failure. So first, not using one's embodied state to help to prepare as many souls as possible for salvation is a failure to fulfill our purpose. And second, not using one's embodied state to help prepare as many souls as possible for salvation is missing the opportunity of the pleasure of serving Christ in the construction of his temple and enjoying the reward of our efforts. Okay, so why risk it? Why deliberately involve ourselves in the development of appropriate and well-structured love in our neighbors? Like so many elements of Malebranche's system, to answer this question is to confront the fact of human life and its immense burdens. On the one hand, embodied humans are tossed about by their passions and imaginations, living every moment with the base and terrible consequences of Adam's and Eve's sins. On the other hand, humans are the creations and children of God, enjoying an intimate epistemic and moral relationship with him. To love your neighbor, for Malebranche, the duty to love your neighbor is a perfect illustration of the way the baseness of human life comes into conversation with the divinity of human life. Loving your neighbor is really just loving God through your neighbor. It is loving a terrestrial being in order to serve and love the divine being. We can protect ourselves with reminders about the contagion of men's opinions and behavior, and with the purposeful employment of flattery and deception to manipulate other people's self-love for our own purposes. Nevertheless, it's risky, but we have to try, because it is, I think, what Malebranche thinks we owe to each other. And on the Malebranchian system, if I have a duty to you, it is really a duty that I have to God. And if there's anything for Malebranche worth risking our own salvation and virtue for, it's to fulfill a duty to God. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we have questions and answers at the end. Meanwhile, if you do have questions or you want to signal that you will have questions at the end, you can write and signal in the chat so that I know how to organize the discussion. Our second speaker tonight is Ali Benjamin Israel, and his talk is the title is Perfection and Pleasure in Malebranche's Theory of Love, as you already seen on the slides. So Ali, you have the floor.
Perfect, thank you, Dana. Sorry, so I'm going to be taking exactly up where Julie left us with Malebranche's account of our love for God. But the issue that I want to raise regards the motives for loving God, and ultimately it's an issue about Malebranche's moral psychology. For Malebranche, the love for God is the most foundational principle of morality, and ultimately what should be determining our ends and guiding our actions. He claims that by loving God, who is absolute perfection, relations of perfection are revealed to us. This term is a very convoluted one, but what he means by it is that by knowing and loving God in all his perfection, we can evaluate the perfection of other beings and love them and act towards them accordingly. So here's the plan for what I want us to do today. In the first section, I'll start off by introducing these motives. The motives for loving God are his perfection and the pleasure we find in loving him. As we'll see shortly, Malebranche claims we love God through these two distinct kinds of love, or perhaps they are both sufficient motives for loving God. This claim led Malebranche to the center of a controversy around Quietism in his time. I'll briefly use this historical argument in order to point out the confusion or ambiguity Malebranche has created about the motivational grounds for loving God. Then, in the second section, I present you with two central problems that stem from taking perfection and pleasure as grounds for divine love at the same time. The problem of overdetermination and the problem of impure or wrong motives. In the third section, we'll start working on an interpretation to avoid these problems. I'll first go through Malebranche's will or faculty of desire, which is first and foremost the capacity to love. And I'll explain how love for different objects comes about according to Malebranche. In most cases of love, we love finite, particular, and permanent objects. There is a very clear how pleasure can be associated with perfection in these cases. However, in our case, where we have God as an infinite, general, indeterminate thing, it's more complicated. And this is exactly what I want us to do in the final section of this talk, where I will argue that the love for God cannot follow the standard stages of love. Under the alternative, I will suggest perfection and pleasure do participate together in our love for God, but only perfection is capable of grounding it, while pleasure is merely a necessary consequence that we can hope for. So let's start with the following quote from the Treatise of Morality. Malebranche says, "We must love perfection as well as felicity. By creating man, God has given him in love of the good, and by the impression of love which he bears toward himself, as if to say two loves, that of felicity and that of perfection. By love of felicity, he united man to his power, which alone can make him happy. And by love of perfection, he has united man to his wisdom, which alone can make us perfect and which ought to guide us as our inviolable law. God is, so to speak, divinely animated by these two loves. They're inseparable in him and cannot be separated in us without our being lost completely." Now, in this passage, Malebranche says that pleasure and perfection are two distinct motives in which we love God. I make the shift from felicity or happiness to pleasure, as he claims elsewhere, God makes us happy by the enjoyment of pleasures and unhappy by the suffering of pains. Now, it seems reasonable to understand this as claiming that they are each sufficient motives for loving God. We just love him for different characteristics he has, as his power or his wisdom. And he also says that both motives are good and inseparable in him, and yet just love of perfection can ground the moral law. The emphasis on perfection as what grants us the foundation for morality leads Malebranche to one of the most heated debates of his time in the French church, where he was accused of being a Quietist. Now, Quietism was a controversial group in Christianity that defended that one should love God with no personal regard, no concern about his personal interests, and complete renunciation of the self. Or in the classic thought experiment, the Quietist would agree to eternal torment if that's what God wanted him to do. The accusation of Quietism first came from François Lamy, one of Malebranche's close disciples. Lamy took Malebranche's strong commitment to the idea of love of perfection and his occasionalist position as grounds for denying all personal considerations. Actually, Julie and Thomas Lennon correctly take Lamy's argument to be quite plausible. And they said that Malebranche's definition of God as the only true good poses all other goods as expendable in favor of him, and this occasionalism seems to empty personal initiative from all relevance. However, Malebranche denied Lamid's accusation by reinforcing the importance of love, of felicity or pleasure, coming to claim that pleasure is the sole motive of human will. Now, this claim not only gets Malebranche to be accused of hedonism by Arnaud, but it does not align with his claim that we can also naturally love God by his perfection. I take this historical episode to mean one thing. Both sides, Lamy and Malebranche, were correct in a sense. Both loves are necessary, and the whole discussion stems from an ambiguity in Malebranche's system regarding what grounds our love for God and what participates in it in other ways. If so, the true question is not if Malebranche was a quietist. I mean, if we look at his practical philosophy, it is very clearly the fact that love for God must be grounded in perfection, at least by perfection, in order for us to access these relations of perfection that shape all our moral principles. The real question is in what way exactly pleasure is involved in our love for God. If pleasure takes the same role as perfection does, motivating us to love God, grounding this love actually, then we would be falling into two very significant problems. The first is the problem of overdetermination, namely when two sufficient causes determine our love, in this case, perfection and pleasure. One of the main objections against overdetermination is that it involves an implausible coincidence, as every act would necessitate two distinct systems to converge. In our case, for the two loves to be inseparable, as Malebranche demands, we would need the most perfect thing to be also the most pleasurable thing. This for itself is not really a problem for Malebranche, as he could argue that there is an occasionalist law that overcomes this problem. God could perfectly create a law that converges between perfection and pleasure in acts of love, and this is exactly what he seems to be going for when he says, the quote, "These two loves, felicity and perfection, are inseparable in him and cannot be separated in us." This may avoid the objection of intolerable coincidence, but the problem of overdetermination is still pressing for another and more serious reason. Sorry. For Malebranche, love of perfection is not merely a sufficient cause, but a necessary one, that without it, a moral law cannot come about. Now, there cannot be necessary conditions or motives whatsoever in any case of overdetermination. This would be incoherent with the very description of those cases, because if two different causes are equally independently capable of producing a certain effect, assigning one of them as necessary would make the other incapable of causing it alone. If perfection is a necessary condition, pleasure, by definition, cannot be sufficient to love God. Now, we know from Malebranche's account of unordered self-love that one may love God instrumentally, only due to the happiness she finds in God. Therefore, loving God solely out of pleasure is definitely wrong, but still, it's a possible thing. The second problem is that pleasure is the wrong kind of motives, which would undermine the validity and purity of Malebranche's moral system. The love for God reveals us moral principles through relations of perfection. Therefore, moral principles are known to be shaped by the perfection of the beings we are interacting with and nothing else. Now, if we introduce pleasure as an additional ground for loving God, we lose certainty about the origins of our moral principles. They might still reflect the perfection of God. They might still be correct moral principles, but they are not necessarily products of perfection. Actions according to these principles might be morally permissible, but the agent would not be praiseworthy. The demand of acting in a certain way because moral commitment is present in many moral theories, it also seems like Malebranche adheres to the same demand. It does not affect the permissibility of the act, but the praiseworthiness of the agent. So just to sum up what we had to this moment, I presented first the two kinds of love that we have towards God and pointed out the ambiguity about which of them serves as grounds for loving him. I showed then how different positions about this question led Malebranche to be part of the controversy about Quietism, In addition, I have argued that if we take both to be sufficient grounds for loving God at the same time, then we fall into a problem of overdetermination or a problem of bad motives. Now, I want us to start working on a solution for these problems. And the first step will be to understand the realm in which love arises in our minds. Sorry. Oh, okay. So in the search, Malebranche distinguishes between two different faculties of the human mind, the understanding and the will. The understanding is the faculty that perceives or that knows, since only it receives ideas of objects, and the will is the capacity the soul has of loving different goods. For our purposes, we'll obviously be focusing on the latter. However, the understanding is still very important. The will is blind, it does not have objects of its own. And according to Malebranche, the only thing we perceive directly and in the most immediate way is God. So the will receives its objects from the understanding. The rule that guides the will through the different objects of perception is, as we saw in the previous code, the good. We are programmed to love good things. It's an imperative of our creation that we are inclined towards the good. As we can see in the following passage, you can see the second here in the slide, since the mind's inclination are undoubtedly the constant impression of the will of him who has created and preserves them, it seems to be that these inclinations must be exactly like those of the creator and preserver. By their very nature, then, they can have no other principle and than his glory. He cannot create a creature without directing it towards himself and commanding it to love him more than all things. So God in his perfect creation must have created us inclined towards the good and inclined towards himself. This general inclination produces all our secondary natural inclinations, as for example, also our inclination for self-preservation, which brings us to self-love. In fact, the inclination to preserve ourselves provides a normative justification for concern with our own happiness and our own pleasure. Malebranche even says that God, and I quote, wills that they all have a natural inclination for the preservation and happiness because they cannot be happy without existing. Now we'll shortly see how this concern for our pleasure can be problematic to our love for God, but let's see how exactly we achieve this love for anything from the structure of the will. Malebranche does not provide us a step-by-step account of how love comes about from the general inclination, and just stems from very different passages in his work. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll base the process on the interpretation of Slay, Chappelle, and De La Rocca, which sum the process in what I saw as 4 different stages. So our first stage, the starting point, is in the presence of our natural inclinations towards the good in general, towards God. Then, in the second stage, we have an encounter with an object, and we have an inclination to judge the object, a particular object, as a good object or as godlike. Third, when the will approves the object, endorses the object, we experience the feeling of pleasure at the thought of possessing that good. And finally, in stage 4, the pleasure induces a preference for the particular good, characterizing the love for it. Now, this model emphasizes how pleasure acts as a motive and explains how love plays within the faculty of desire. In the characterization of love as a feeling of possessing the object, it becomes very clear how love is a form of wanting. In the wanting, we find the pleasure that brings to a preference for the object, a love for the object. Now, this model is easy to apply in cases of particular goods, but in the case of God, in the case for love for God, stage 2 seems irrelevant, as there is no particular indeterminate object that can be judged to be good. The closest thing to a judgment directed towards good lies in the fact that we can perceive particular objects as godlike. But this would not be sufficient for generating love for God himself in his totality. In other words, stage 1 and 2 seem to be directed towards the same thing, which might be problematic for inducing pleasure in stage 3. Now, Malebranche says God is a pure, indeterminate good and irreducible to any object. Its generality contrasts with our finite nature and limited understanding. And this contrast explains the fact that our first and general inclination towards the good produces secondary inclinations to particular things. Its generality and formality, by formality I mean just that it doesn't have any content, any matter, but it's just based on relations. I mean to provide us only with, they are translated into the particular human context, giving specific content to the inclination. God's immaterial nature makes him present to us only in this sense, and thus his impression toward the general good takes particular meaning when it reaches the minds of human beings. Therefore, when we love good things orderly, we love God through them. This love is rooted in pleasure through the particular inclinations that we hold. However, this is not sufficient for establishing the love for God himself. To explicitly direct our love to God, we need a different model of love. As I said, it seems like the initial problem we have is with applying the four stages model, the stage 1 and stage 2 together. These two stages were about the passage from the general inclination to a particular perception. Namely, there's an act of narrowing the scope of our inclination, allowing us to experience the pleasure and the thought of possessing this narrow thing, this particular appearance of goodness, described in stage 3. However, in the direct love for God, the narrowing does not happen. The universal form of good that gives content to the inclination is the same as our object. Forcing the narrowing act upon the love for God can at best make us see the object as God-like, but that would only induce love for the particular object and take only a partial idea of God as our object, which would fail to be the requirement for loving perfection. So we know that God is an available object for the will, since we know God through a direct and immediate perception. As a matter of fact, God is the only thing we perceive in such a way. He's available for the will. However, as Moriarty argues, the movement towards the good is directed to particular objects by their relations to us, and we are attached to those objects by pleasure. In other words, pleasure arises from the love for God only by the specification of the first and general inclination to some object that reflects the good in a partial and material way. What naturally follows from this distinction is that in the love for God, we cannot have pleasure at the thought of possessing a particular good expressed in stage 3. This would demand the kind of reduction and specification we must avoid. In a sense, the love for God is directed and immediate in the same way that God is perceived directly and immediately by understanding. In this kind of love, we would go from a natural inclination towards the good in stage 1 to the perception of God as good in stage 2, merely by attending or reflecting to the general inclination towards the good. Then, since we lack a particular object for possessing as God lacks matter, stage 3, the stage where we have pleasure, becomes irrelevant. The preference for God as himself present in stage 4 becomes a direct result of this act of reflection upon the general inclination. We do not prefer him because we feel pleasure, but we choose to prefer him for understanding that he's perfect. This way of understanding our love for God conforms with Malebranche's definition of this love as free, as he says, I quote, "Let the soul love and fear only God if by love we mean free love, a love by choice, a reasoning love. Love determined by pleasure cannot be free, for it's produced by the sensation we get from the thought of possessing the object. In contrast, free love is an act of love based exclusively on conscious understanding. From the mere perception of his perfection, we are not forced to succumb to love, but we choose to give ourselves to love of perfection. The question that remains open is how the necessary connection to pleasure and happiness can occur if this love is not rooted or not grounded in the love of felicity. One possible way of making sense of this claim is by posing pleasure not as a motive, but as a necessary consequence of the love for God. Malebranche seems to allow such an interpretation when he sets God and happiness in a causal relation, saying, only he is clearly and evidently recognized as true good. He is the only genuine cause of happiness. A possible objection to this solution is that Malebranche's claim in the search that love is not free in the sense that it is not the power of our will not to wish to be happy. This seems to mean that the will cannot consent to anything without taking happiness into consideration. And indeed, we cannot wish not to be happy. But this does not force us to take pleasure as grounds for our love, but only to hope for that love of God will result in happiness. In this sense, Malebranche is a hypothetical pietist. If God was not the cause of happiness, if God wanted us to be tormented to an eternity, then we will still be obliged to love him just by his perfection. But that is not the case. And there is an occasionalist law that converges between perfection and happiness. And for this reason, we may hope to achieve happiness. So in conclusion, this is the model I suggest. First, there is a natural inclination towards the good in general. Then in stage 2, we judge God to be good in general. This is a reflection on his very perception. In stage 3, we are in a position to adopt a preference for him, characterizing a love for God. And finally, with that love established, we may hope for pleasure as God is the genuine cause of happiness. In this way, the only grounds for loving God is love of perfection. Pleasure comes at a later stage as a consequence of loving God, and we are only entitled to hope for it. Through this proposal, we arrive at the Malebranche that anticipates in his practical philosophy many themes that will only be later in the Enlightenment be taken as basic demands for morality, as the autonomy present in the free love for God and the purity of motives that is expressed in the rational character of this love. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Again, I remind everyone, questions at the end. Just signal in the chat that you want to ask questions. And we move to our third presentation today. Hans Schenk will talk about what astronomers are thinking, Malebranche on knowing other minds. Hans, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you. As she said, I'm going to be talking about what Malebranche thinks we can know about other minds, how we come to know it, and how confident we can be about it. I think that this is not quite as much about God and not quite as much about love as the first two presentations, but for me, it addresses a question that I think is really important to the general theme in understanding how Malebranche thinks about the connections that we have to other people. I want to note also that just kind of right at the outset, that the presentation has shifted a tiny bit, but in a significant way since I submitted the abstract. And I just want to flag that right off the bat, and I'll explain it at the relevant moment. But the basic problem, as I see it, the thing that I've been trying to puzzle through is that, let's see, my window is not quite working. Here we go. That Malebranche presumes knowledge of other minds. So he says that the search after truth is a study of the mind of man in its entirety. And the search, as we've already seen from Julie and from Ellie, is filled with assertions and claims about things that are true of other minds. But Malebranche also says that we can only know other minds through conjecture. And his explanation of conjecture and what he means by conjecture is brief, it's complex, and the few attempts in the literature to explain on Malebranche's behalf what he means by conjecture are, I think, very useful. They're very helpful, but I think that they are possibly incomplete. And so I will be suggesting an interpretation of Malebranche's account of conjecture that is it is a kind of Cartesian analogy, not analogy. That's not what I want to say. A Cartesian inference that starts from a few things that we know for certain and extrapolates more information from there. So the way that I'm going to be doing that is I'm going to run through a quick sample of claims that Malebranche makes about other minds. We've already heard some of those from Ellie and Julie. I will also be going through a couple of relevant epistemological considerations, especially from the same chapter where Malebranche talks about conjecture, focusing in then a little bit on the conjecture passage itself, and an abbreviated version of it. And then going over the two existing interpretations, I've paraphrased them. The first is the analogical interpretation, which takes Malebranche's account of conjecture to be a kind of argument from analogy. And then the second one, which I'm calling the disclosure interpretation, which assumes that the way we find out information about other minds is analogous to communication. And so it models learning about other minds on Malebranche's model of communication. I'm going to suggest that both of those are useful and are part of how we learn about other minds, but taken as explanations for the whole of conjecture, they're incomplete, in part because the analogical interpretation on its own takes human bodies as an informational starting point, which Malebranche both seems to be in favor of in some places, but elsewhere speaks against in strong terms. And the disclosure interpretation is limited to things that could be known in a communicative way, and also has some textual inconsistencies with Malebranche's account of conjecture and then his broader epistemological framework. So I'm going to instead, as I said, propose an interpretation that starts from one or two things that we know for certain, or that Malebranche thinks we know for certain. They'll be familiar, and extrapolates from their reasons from there to further truths and further information about other human minds, and starts from certainty and it ends with what we could probably call informed speculation. And here's where I want to note the shift from when I submitted my abstract. I am not going to discuss how Malebranche thinks we come to know that other minds exist. My reasons for that, well, there are several reasons. The main one is that all commentators that I've read agree that Malebranche believes that we know that other minds exist and we can know and we know for certain. They don't agree on how we know that on how Malebranche thinks that we know that other minds exist. And a survey of what textual evidence for one position or another that I could find kind of started to present it itself as another enormous research project in addition to this. And moreover, I think the conjecture passage does not reference the question of the existence of other minds. And I don't think that my interpretation of Malebranche's idea of conjecture requires us to be certain of the existence of other minds. It works just as easily for how we know about any other minds that might exist. So for that reason, I'm bracketing the question of how we know about the existence of other minds and focusing just on what the conjecture passage itself describes to us. So with that in mind, I want to run through a sampling of claims that Malebranche makes about other minds. This is certainly not comprehensive. We've already seen some of these and some parallels in the other two presentations. So here are some things that Malebranche says about that he claims are true of all minds. It says, all men have a certain disposition of the brain that naturally inclines them to behave in the same way as some of those with whom they live. It says the mind of man is limited, and every limited mind is by its nature subject to error. He also says these errors are almost all consequences of the mind's union with the body. Further, all minds, when contemplating the same intelligible substance, which for him is the mind of God, necessarily find therein the same relations of magnitude or the same speculative truths. He also makes some claims about the differences between minds, either of groups or of individuals. Most of these differences from Malebranche come down to the composition of the body. He says it is easy enough to explain all the different characters encountered among the minds of man, on the one hand, by the abundance and scarcity, rapidity or slowness of agitation, and by the density or lightness of the animal spirits, and on the other hand, by the delicacy or the coarseness, the moistness and dryness, malleability of the brain fibers, and finally, by the relation of the animal spirits might have to these fibers. Animal spirits for Malebranche are a kind of neurological liquid that flows through the body, communicates between all of the body, all of the limbs, the extremities, and the brain, and the animal spirits and the brain fibers together regulate the senses, which represent material reality to the body, always in conjunction with ideas perceived in the mind of God in ways that allow the body to respond for its preservation. The imagination represents bodies that are absent. So we can think of things like prospection, anticipation, planning. This is the role of the imagination. And the passions are bodily volitions that move the body based on the information from the senses and the speculation of the imagination to carry out actions that promote the body's well-being. So this is kind of what's going on, what leads to a great many of the differences between individual minds. So here are some claims Malebranche makes about the mental states of specific minds or groups of people. He says this of astronomers, that they permit themselves to be dazzled by a false idea of grandeur that flatters and excites them. In this case, the idea is that the loftiness of the subject matter dictates the loftiness of a study. So astronomers think, what could be grander than the study of the celestial spheres? And they dedicate themselves to that, which Malebranche sees as a kind of egomania. He says this about Tertullian, that Tertullian says anything that comes into his mind, provided it be some extraordinary thought, and that he have some bold expression through which he might hope to parade the strength, or better, the derangement of his imagination. Similar to astronomers and Tertullian, he has this to say about werewolves. A man, through a deranged effort of his imagination, falls into this madness when he believes he becomes a wolf every night. This disorder of his mind disposes him to perform all the actions of wolves, or those he has heard wolves do. Thus he leaves his house at midnight, he stalks the streets, throws himself upon some child he encounters there, bites and mauls him, and stupid and superstitious people imagine that this fanatic has really become a wolf because the wretch believes it himself and has secretly told some people who are unable to conceal it. So in addition to people being persuaded by the autobiographical accounts of so-called werewolves, Malebranche makes some other claims about the relations between minds, especially mediated by communication. He says that those who imagine things strongly express them strongly, and those whom they persuade are convinced by their air and through sensible impression, rather than by the strength of arguments. And he says, as we also saw in Julie's presentation, infants in their mother's womb see only what their mothers see. And even when they have come into the world, they imagine few things of which their parents are not the cause. For even the wisest of men guide themselves by the imagination of others, by opinion and custom rather than by the rules of reason. It's interesting to speculate then if that we imagine few things of which our parents are not the cause, where the imagination that leads to believing oneself to be a werewolf comes from, but we'll leave that for now. So I want to move on then, actually stop for a second and say that I think the question then is, Malebranche makes these and many other claims about that reasonably apply beyond his own mind, about what's happening with other minds. And the question is, can his epistemological framework support these claims? And actually, I think perhaps the better phrasing of the question is, what is it in Malebranche's epistemological framework, in his work about epistemology, that persuaded him that he could make all of these claims and justify all of these claims? Presumably, he did think so. So I want to look now at a few of the relevant epistemological considerations, especially those in the same chapter as conjecture, and then move from there to thinking about conjecture more directly. So the first thing, it feels especially almost crass to summarize the vision in God in 2 bullet points, but I'm going to do that. The idea is that God has an idea, a clear idea of everything that exists, because God created everything that exists, and also because God continues to sustain the existence of all those things. So God understands everything and has in his mind a divine idea, sort of a version almost of something like Platonic forms of things that exist. And we see all things in God through our union with the mind of God. Our minds are united to the mind of God, and so we see things through ideas there. This leads to Malebranche extrapolating from those 2 points, these 4 ways of knowing. So we can know things by themselves. You can see that the thing that we know by itself is the mind of God. We are united immediately to it. And everything that we see through the mind of God. So the second way of knowing things is we can know things through their ideas in the mind of God. This is bodies. God has an idea of the bodies, and through our union with his mind, we see them there. The third way of knowing is that we can know things through consciousness or inner sensations. This is how we come to know our own minds. We come to know our own minds only through these ways. Our knowledge of our soul is limited to what we sense taking place in us. Malebranche says if we had never sensed pain, heat, light, and such, we would be unable to know whether the soul was capable of sensing these things because we do not know it through an idea. But if we saw in God the idea corresponding to our soul, we would at the same time know, or at least could know, all the properties of which it is capable. We don't know all the properties of which it is capable, only those which we have experienced in it. Finally, the fourth way of knowing things, the one I want to think a little bit more about, is that we can know things through conjecture. We know the minds of others through conjecture. Malebranche says this: through conjecture, we know those things that are different, both from ourselves and what we know either in itself or through ideas, such as when we believe that certain things are like certain others we know. So how do we know the minds of others? We conjecture that the souls of other men are of the same sort as our own. We suppose them to feel what we feel in ourselves, and even when these sensations have no relation to the body, we are certain we are not mistaken because we see in God certain ideas and immutable laws from which we know with certainty that God acts uniformly in all minds. I know that twice 2 is 4, that it is better to be just than rich, and I am not mistaken in believing that others know these truths as well as I do. I have love, pleasure, and good, abhor pain and evil, and want to be happy. Again, not mistaken in believing that all men, the angels, and even demons, that is, both embodied and potentially disembodied minds, have these same inclinations. I know that God will never make a mind, as Ellie pointed out earlier, that does not desire to be happy or that can desire to be unhappy. And finally, when the body plays a part in what happens in me, I am almost always mistaken in judging others by myself. The knowledge we have of other men is very liable to error if we judge them by only the sensations we have of ourselves. So this is certainly an abridged and abbreviated presentation of the passage, but I think it brings out there are some ideas in play, or notions, I should say. Ideas is a tricky word with Malebranche. Some notions in play about what conjecture is, and it isn't immediately easy to tease out what is happening. So there have been there have been a number of reactions to this account of conjecture, and probably the one I've found most often is in the literature is people saying, his account of conjecture is brief and unclear, and then folks move on. And I think that's a very sensible reaction most of the time, but because I am concerned with the way that he explains his many statements about other minds, I think it's worth our time to investigate further. I should also note in passing that Locke has a different perspective here, which is that conjecture can't yield knowledge. So he also just drops the account. He says, this is about opinion. It's not about knowledge at all. And Arnaud, this will become relevant, I think, later. Arnaud says that there's nothing wrong with saying that we only see souls of other men by conjecture, provided that the word conjecture is taken to generally mean whatever we don't know at a single glance, and whatever we do know by reasoning, and that we think that by reasoning, we can also know things through clear ideas. So those are two. I won't be spending any time really on those two, although you might see some hints of Arnaud's response in my interpretation. But the most popular explanation of Malebranche's account of conjecture is what I'm calling the analogical interpretation. So the idea here is that we perceive other bodies that look and behave like our own, or rather that when we do, we infer from that similarity, a further similarity, that they are animated by minds, like our body is animated by a mind, and that the minds that stand behind those bodies are similar to the mind that stands behind our body. So there's some textual support for this idea. Certainly there's a lot lot of textual support for the idea that judgments of similarity play a role in how we come to know other minds. The most probably cited passage is this one. We conjecture that the souls of other men are of the same sort as our own, suppose them to feel what we feel in ourselves, and even when these sensations have no relation to the body, we are certain we are not mistaken because we see in God certain ideas and immutable laws from which we know with certainty that God acts uniformly in all minds. I have a list of 3 places where a version of this account occurs. I'm not going to go over them in any detail. I think there are some strengths to the analogical interpretation, and the main one is that conjecture clearly involves judgments of similarity. There's textual evidence that some kind of judging that another thing is like one we already know. This is part of what's going on with conjecture. Malebranche endorses self-observation as a way of understanding the inclinations and passions of other humans elsewhere in the search as well, which we will actually get to a little bit later. But I think that the analogical interpretation also has some significant limitations. And the first one is just that. It's limited. It can only explain analogically derived claims about other minds. So we might think that some claims such as that all minds are finite and limited and subject to error through their union with the body, it's not clear that we can make that claim purely on the basis of analogy. There has to be some other judgment of similarity between limited minds and our own. Also, Malebranche rejects the idea that bodily behavior can inform us about minds. This is specifically in the context of his rejection of analogical reasoning to the idea that animals have minds or souls. He says that our soul does not form our body, it does not digest our food, it gives no movement and heat to our blood, and our body can receive nothing from what is found in our mind. So he says that when people look at animal behavior is sufficiently similar to human behavior that we think that they must have minds, but in fact, the behavior of the body is dictated and regulated by the passions in conjunction with the senses and the imagination and cannot tell us about what is happening with the mind. The second interpretation is I've seen less often and is slightly more complex, but the general idea is, I'm calling it the disclosure interpretation, and the idea is that words and sensible signs in the actions of other bodies direct our attention towards ideas in the mind of God that explain other minds. Part of this is that we have a partial, unclear idea of the mind. I'm going to kind of go through 3, I'm going to talk about communication and then the unclear idea of other minds quickly. So God transforms air struck by vocal organs into words and empowers the hearer of these words to understand and be attentive to truths the speaker discovers in sovereign reason, which turns the hearer's mind in the same direction as the speaker's. I see what he sees because I look where he looks. And experience teaches us that we cannot communicate our thoughts to one another immediately and by ourselves, but only through speech or some other sensible sign to which we have attached ideas. This interpretation, certainly the version of this interpretation that I see in Avramides and other minds, says that sensible signs can mean actions of the body. So this depends, though, on there being some kind of an idea of the mind that can be shared. And this is problematic because Malebranche clearly says that we don't have an idea of the mind. And this interpretation, the disclosure interpretation, hinges on the thought that we do possess an idea of the mind, but not a clear one. There's some evidence for this. Malebranche says that I say elsewhere that we have no idea of our soul because the idea we have of our soul is no clearer than the idea we have of the mysteries of faith. And he says the mysteries of faith, we have a notion, but it's not a clear one. Finally, we can communicate about the mind. It's not immediately clear from this passage, but this passage is part of a broader one where we cannot communicate about sensations or experiences without the other party having had that same experience. So after we bring someone near fire or show them pictures of fire, we can communicate about fire to them. prior to which we cannot. So the upshot is that we learn about other minds when words or sensible signs employed by bodies disclose to us that the other mind shares a characteristic of our own mind, which we have discovered through experience. This process, I should note, is not inferential. The words and signs disclose to us the aspect of the other mind by pointing us toward the unclear idea of the mind that we see in the mind of God, where this unclear idea I see as a kind of outline, an unfilled outline, and our experience adds properties that we can think of a mind as having. And when someone else expresses an idea about their experience that is also found in our unclear idea of the mind, then we learn something about them. Obviously, the idea of the unclear, or the notion of the unclear idea, is controversial, but a strength of this interpretation is that it certainly helps explain how we learn about other minds through communication. And you might think that there has to be an account of how we learn about other minds through communication, and it's not clear what that would be without something like the unclear idea of the mind. And further, the unclear idea of the mind is useful for understanding not just communication, but all of the ways we think about minds. Again, this is limited. It can only explain communicated knowledge about other minds. So for instance, the limitation of all minds, it's difficult to see how that would be disclosed to us through communication. And there are some textual issues. Malebranche doesn't make any attempt to link the idea of conjecture to his model of communication, whereas he does hint at judgments of similarity. And the disclosure interpretation does not obviously involve judgments of similarity. And as a consequence of which, it's not clear why the disclosure of body-independent facts about other minds, like inclinations and mathematical knowledge, is more certain than body-dependent facts about other minds if all of them are being disclosed through communication. So I'm going to instead suggest an inferential interpretation. The idea here is that our knowledge of other minds is gained through a series of connected inferences, starting from what we know for certain and progressing to informed speculation. So that's the basic idea, but I think in this passage we can see a way that this series of inferences would work, which I've laid out here. So through our union with the mind of God, we know that God exists, and we know that our mind exists. Malebranche says elsewhere, but as for evidence, it seems to me that it is incomplete and that we are not invincibly led to believe there is something other than God and our own mind, invincibly here via our union with the mind of God. We know that God acts uniformly in all minds. This is dealt with elsewhere, but also here. We see certain ideas and immutable laws that show us that God acts uniformly in all minds. We also know that other minds are like our own in certain important respects. I know that twice 2 is 4. We know that other minds have the same mathematical and moral truths that we do, some of the same inclinations as we do. We also know about our own minds that some of the contents of our minds supervene on the composition of our bodies. And we can, through the uniformity of God's action in minds, presume that this is the same for other embodied minds. This is where we suppose that other humans feel what we feel in ourselves. And even when these sensations have no relation to the body, we are certain we are not mistaken. We also know that it is more reasonable to believe that God always acts in the same way in establishing the union between our souls and bodies, and that he joins the same ideas and sensations to similar motion of the brain's interior fibers in different people. I think this is an important clarificatory point, which is that we don't know for certain and in detail that our sensations are the same sensations others experience, but in a sort of, but the genre of our experiences, how we perceive light, how we perceive hardness, softness, heat, cold, those things operate in similar ways. Because then the bodies influencing other minds are different from the bodies influencing our mind, and our mental states supervene on the composition of our bodies, our knowledge about the body-dependent contents of other minds is limited to informed speculation. Here we have the knowledge we have of other men is liable to error if we judge them only by the sensations we have of ourselves. In conclusion, I think that this kind of Cartesian, if you will, inference can plausibly account for almost everything. It can explain analogical inference about other minds. We start from the idea that God acts uniformly in other minds. So if other minds exist, God acts in them the same way he acts in ours, including how our mind has been linked by God to our body. Also, communicated disclosure, even though it itself is not inferential, provides data for further inference about what is true of other minds. This approach does not take the body as an informational starting point, but rather explains the similarity of both minds and bodies via the beginning, our union with the mind of God and God's uniformity of action. And finally, this is not limited like the analogical and disclosure interpretations are. This sort of network of inference can handle any way that we might gather information, if it's inferential, like analogy, or even if it is just a source of non-inferential evidence like disclosure. And furthermore, we can assign a confidence level to all claims of knowledge about other minds. In closing, I think that this idea of the continuum of confidence also has textual support from Malebranche. It says, frequent though thought, about the almost infinite ways in which men are tied to sensible objects is of great use, and one of the best ways of becoming knowledgeable in these matters is to study and observe ourselves. Through the experience of what we perceive there, we instruct ourselves with complete certainty about all the inclinations, that is, the non-bodily volitions of other men, and we have fairly certain knowledge of a large part of the passions to which they are subject. But if we add to this experience the knowledge of the particular circumstances men find themselves in, and a knowledge of the judgments belonging to each of the passions that we shall discuss in what follows, we perhaps shall have less difficulty in guessing most of their actions than astronomers do in predicting eclipses. And one of the things that we can predict, and that Malebranche predicts, is why the astronomers are so hung up on predicting eclipses in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hans, and thank you all for this very well-timed session. So we have plenty of time for questions and interventions. And we actually have some people in the chat that have announced their intention to ask questions in the chat. So I'm going to take them in the order in which they have announced themselves. Colin Chamberlain.
Oh, great. Thanks. Thanks all. It's always fun to think about Malebranche for a little bit. Julie, I want to ask you about two things. One is very kind of zoomed in, and the other is a bigger picture question. So the zoomed in question is just about one of the passages you put up where Malebranche says, and this is the whole purpose that God put us on this earth. I wasn't sure whether you were taking that to attach to the first part of that passage where Malebranche is saying to construct Christ's temple, or the kind of middle part of the passage where he was focused specifically on loving our neighbors. So I wasn't sure what's whether the whole purpose is kind of a general thing, constructing the temple, or whether you think that loving our neighbors has a more kind of special status. I hope that made sense. And then the bigger picture question is, I'm wondering to what extent you see Malebranche's own dialogues as models for how we should love each other, because it's significant, right, that he writes dialogues and conversations, and I wonder if we can see Theodore, for example, modeling appropriate ways for relating to other human beings, and if that is kind of part of your argument and picture.
Thanks so much, Colin. So yeah, two great questions. So to the first question, Eric Stenzel, who's also here, and I wrote a paper about Malebranche on this or at least my understanding of Malebranche is sort of on this very question. I think your question can be reframed to be, why does God create anything at all? Right, that's zooming out even further. And Eric and I argue that there's only one reason for Malebranche's God to create. It's to see his son incarnate. And so if that is God's sole reason for creation, and Christ's role post-incarnation is building his celestial temple and getting souls in their proper dispositions to be considered by Christ is the sort of action of loving our neighbor, then I know there's a lot of ifs there, but I think what it sort of comes down to is that, why did God create humans? I think God created humans in order to build the celestial body of Christ. And insofar as we have to love our neighbors to help that body get built, there's no other reason why we're here. So I think actually we are here to love our neighbor, and loving our neighbor is going to help with the sort of bigger goal of furnishing Christ with souls to build that temple. Does that seem plausible?
Yeah, I guess I wonder whether, like, so you grant that, like, the only reason human beings exist is to kind of contribute to the temple. There might be like a whole bunch of different ways in which we contribute to the temple. Like, one might be loving our neighbor, another might be just kind of like sacrificing our own pleasures to God. So I guess I don't see, I guess I don't think it follows that just because loving our neighbor contributes to the temple, that like loving our neighbor is our only purpose on earth, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say one more thing that, you and I can talk more about this later too. I mean, Malebranche does say that if we had a choice between our own salvation and the salvation of our neighbor, or like, actually, I really like the French prochain here. I think it's a much better word, or I don't know, it's a much sort of, it has more packed into it than just neighbor. But in any case, that we should prefer the salvation of our neighbor to ourselves. So I think that there's some compelling textual evidence in his work to suggest that the work really is to the other, not to the self, especially, as you know, because he thinks we can't even know how virtuous we are. It's opaque to us, really, what the status of our virtue is. So focusing on ourselves might actually be a mistake for that reason. As for your other question, so I recently started doing a little bit of work on Malebranche's dialogue with a Chinese philosopher, and it astonished me to discover that fully half of Malebranche's works are dialogues or conversations, or sort of written in the dialogical form. I had never sort of considered that before. And, I had a conversation with Tom Lennon about this, and I was like, oh, what do you like? Do you have any ideas about what's going on here? And he was like, Julie, in at least one of the dialogues, Malebranche is taking the voice of Christ. So there's a little bit of hubris possibly going on there. But more seriously to your question, I think absolutely. I remember saying to Tom once years ago, after kind of getting into Malebranche, thinking like, why did Malebranche even bother writing The Search After Truth? Like, everything is the worst. Like, what's the point of doing anything when the sort of view of human nature is so, it seems like we're in such a deep struggle. And it seems like the answer is the answer you alluded to, Colin, that like this is part of the process of trying to save, is helping people better understand their own minds and their own situations in order to have the right, the appropriate love relationships with order and with God. So I think that's a really nice way of thinking about his corpus. Thanks.
Thank you. Catherine Hamilton.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have never been here before. My friend J.B. Shank let me know about this. And I should say that I am an interloper as a historian here, not trained in philosophy. But I have found myself dragged down the Malebranche rabbit hole for many, many years. So I'm there with you guys, but just in a different way. So, okay, so this is so interesting to me, the stuff that you are working on. And Julie, especially, I resonated so, like Malebranche, like with so many of the things in your talk. So I have this article coming out this summer about fashion in Malebranche, which is such an obvious topic, right? And sort of reading fashion as a kind of case study, a sort of side effect of the way he's wired us for sociability through this imitative instinct, and how this works through different kinds of brain tissues, some of them, more persuasive, which align nicely with social dominance, and some of them more imitative. So one of the things, oh, and just about the dialogues before I forget, I think that's so funny, that voice of Christ part, totally. But you also have somebody like Ariste, who is there as a representative of Le Monde. It's like a dialogue like Dominique Bourg would write, in a way. You have, an Eudox and an Ariste, and one of them is presenting the correct view. But in my opinion, this is about how to reach polite society. This is about how do you take this, what I see as Malebranche's project of salvific enlightenment, and make it accessible to these polite readers of the time, because they're not. It's like Fontenelle with Monde, right? They need to be brought in, and Malebranche, above anyone, is so acutely aware of how we need to persuade through the body, right? Anyway, I don't know if I have a question very well formulated. One small one is, you quoted from that bit in the Treatise on Nature and Grace about how we can change our body's construction. And I just wanted to clarify, you weren't suggesting that Malebranche thinks we can really do that as adults, were you? Okay. So, because this is something that I'm thinking about a lot, where is freedom with Malebranche when you are trying to bring other people along with you? For example, with fashion, you want to persuade them that this is going to mislead them, this is a sinful enterprise, but I think he thinks you cannot do that in a way that would push them away, that would stimulate their amour propre, and so there's a very limited pedagogical role for those of us trying to lead the way, to teach others. So I don't know. It's a very diplomatic kind of pedagogy. And I think I might have lost my question, but I know that I definitely want to talk to you, Julie, about this later.
Maybe I could just respond. So one thing,
yeah.
I just want to, so everybody else has to forgive me for a moment, that I just want to fangirl over Catherine here. I'm really happy that you're here. I think your paper on taste and sensibility in Malebranche and your paper on Madame de Lambert are both excellent, and I highly recommend them to everybody who's here. So it's really nice to meet you, and I look forward to chatting more with you. And I think one of the things that I'll just note is that the role of the contagious imagination, I think, is huge in Malebranche. And I had a paper come out in the fall with my colleague Alison McIntyre on Malebranche and Hume on the love of fame. And it's in the open source Journal of Modern Philosophy. And there we sort of compare Hume's mechanism of sympathy with Malebranche's view of the imagination and this kind of social and doxastic contagian. And I think you're exactly right. Like, I think for Hume sort of like, this is what it is. This is what we got. This is what we have to work with. Whereas Malebranche is like, and this is terrible, right? And like, this is unfortunately what we have to work with, and there's no amelioration. Whereas Hume seems to think we could have like ameliorative possibilities with the way that we socialize. And so I think if I've sort of understood your question correctly, if we, the kind of fraught issue of freedom in Malebranche seems to suggest like, how much room do we have to maneuver in order to kind of pull people like away from the abyss? And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll stop. I think actually the role of moral luck in Malebranche is huge. And he, of course, doesn't refer to it as such, but I think there's a lot of moral luck going on in his system that makes it possible for some people to teach and to learn, and other people might be, I think in principle, he thinks everybody can be saved and everybody can have that kind of that moment of conversion, but it's going to be much, much, much harder for some people who are born with less moral luck.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for those kind words. It's always amazing to me if a philosopher reads that. So I'm very happy. So I guess, and this sort of gets at Hans's paper too, what I've been thinking about a lot is how the imagination works in Malebranche as a form of social knowledge. And if I'm talking too much, you can tell me to stop. I'll just stop after this. So he talks about the imagination, right, as that imprinting of an image on the mind, but he really talks about it in ways he doesn't put under that definition as a kind of secret language that works between people. We always know automatically our place in society. We always know through reading others' gestures physically what they're sort of thinking about us and where we rank. And it elicits these automatic behaviors, right? They might be imitative or they might be deferential. So I just think that is interestingly connected to this stuff about duty and how, for Malebranche, I guess because we are limited in freedom in terms of what we can cause, I see him as having God set up these automatic imaginative ties because we cannot do it through reason. We can't do it like through enlightened self-love, right? So we need to be controlled in these imaginative networks. That wasn't a question. It's throwing it out there for discussion, I guess.
Thank you. I think you're exactly right. And I think the challenge, of course, is thinking about how the person who wants to save and who wants to be saved can negotiate and navigate those patterns without being sucked into them. And that's, yeah, Malebranche doesn't give us too much advice about how to do that.
Right, let's move to the next question, Ville Paukonen.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have a question for Julie and a question for Hans, if it's all right. Question to Julie, just very, very briefly. I think this was touched on in the first question already. Just a clarificatory question. When one loves one's neighbor, then according to Malebranche, in fact, is it the case that one in fact loves God and oneself, but not really one's neighbor, or at least not for the sake of one's neighbor? So that's the clarificatory question, whether the neighbor itself has any motivational role or the role as the source of value in the love of neighbors for Malebranche.
I don't think so. Yeah,
Good.
I think,
okay.
and this, yeah.
Good, yeah, but that's what I thought, yeah, okay. Okay, so the second question to Hans is about the kind of knowledge that we get when we come to know other minds. So this is not really about what exactly the method is that we use when we come to gain knowledge of other minds. But I guess I'm puzzled when I read Malebranche, what kind of knowledge is this? Sort of maybe similar word that Locke had. And I think it's exceedingly clear that for Malebranche, I know my own existence, but I don't know my essence or my nature. That's the sort of central point that's made. And when it comes to knowing other minds, we are equally clearly told that we don't know the existence of any other mind, because existence is known via consciousness, or this sentiment intérieur, which we can't have of other minds. But like you pointed out, we do know lots of things about those other minds. And I guess that it cannot either be knowledge of the essence of other minds, whatever that essence of one's mind or anyone's mind really ends up being, because we don't have that knowledge of ourselves. It would be very strange if we would know it of other minds whose existence we don't even know for sure, that is. So the question is, what is it? Still, we seem to know a lot, but what kind of knowledge is this? What kind of category of knowledge does this knowledge fall into that we gain from other minds?
That is a terrific question. I don't know that I have a strong and solid answer right off the bat, because I think it is something that I think a point of uncertainty for me is how to classify our knowledge of our own minds. And I think this came up a bit in the question about the proposed unclear idea of mind for the disclosure interpretation. And so I think the closest thing that I have to a solid answer to that question is that our knowledge of other minds is of the same, it wouldn't go beyond, let me think, we can't know something about other minds that we don't know about our own, which is to say, I mean, we can certainly know that other minds behave differently, but I think that going back to where Malebranche talks about the similarity of sensations and of the way that God attaches ideas to experiences, I think that one of the, we know that God works uniformly in all minds, and I think that basis gives us a basis for thinking that things are at least structurally similar. So I don't know that it's a satisfying answer, but I think that however we classify our knowledge of our own mind, the knowledge of other minds is of a generally similar kind.
Right, next question, Daria Dostrova.
Thank you. I suppose if I may, I have two questions to Eli and then to Hans. I suppose the first should be mostly to Eli. Like being a Catholic, I know very well all this discourse about God's love or our love to God. And it's like very typical discourse that we should, have this intention to good, and that our primary good is God, and all our love to neighbor should be finally directed to love to God. So I'm wondering, in which measure the Malebranche position is typical Catholic position. It's like a kind of priest moral. I mean, can you explain where is his particularity? What is very specific in his position respect to typical theological consideration of love in that century? And a question to Hans. When we are speaking about this analogical inference of other minds, is it only about male minds or female minds also? Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. Very interesting question. I'm not sure if I have a solid answer to it because mainly I don't have the appropriate background for what's the traditional Catholic answer. I'm Jewish, actually. So, but what I would say in response is that Malebranche wants to argue for a love for God that is ultimately the most pleasurable thing, and he does not ignore the fact that we often perceive other things in daily life as more pleasurable, and that we actually need to avoid. But he sees them as a result of the original sin. He sees them as a result of a bad perception, a wrong perception of what is ultimately the most pleasurable thing. If we had a more keen vision of what is pleasurable, then we would see that following the path of God, that knowing God, loving God for His perfection is the best way to feel pleasure and to be happy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think that the knowledge of other minds extends generally. So Malebranche speaks of men's minds often, but my understanding is that he's using that to speak generally about humanity. I think that we might expect that when we come to the place of informed speculation about other minds, though we're fairly certain of their passions, and when we know the kinds of situations they find themselves in, that we would expect our informed speculation to be slightly more likely to be accurate for people who are more like us. And I think that would extend along most dimensions, most continuums of similarity, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Next question, Todd Schmaltz.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just a clarificatory question for Eli and a question for Hans. So I didn't quite get, so what was your view of Malebranche's response to Quietism? I thought at one point you said he was willing to allow for kind of hypothetical Quietism, but I didn't quite follow that, and that didn't seem quite right. Because it seems to me he holds that that kind of pure love is impossible. So that's the clarificatory question. And then for Hans, it seems to me that the view that we see this kind of confused idea of our mind and God as a non-starter as far as the texts go. The contrast is between what we see in God and what we see in ourselves in a confused way through consciousness or inner sense. So I don't know how that interpretation gets off the ground. So there are those questions.
Thank you, Todd. So regarding question, great question. I did say that Malebranche was hypothetical quietist, and he would probably kill me for saying this. But what I meant is that given different circumstances about the nature of God, then he could become a quietist. He's very anti the position of Lamy, because he understands that there is a necessary inseparable connection between perfection and pleasure and felicity, not just in the nature of God, but in the nature of the world. In terms of that being of how achievable, how possible this end of morality to be, I agree with you that it might not be a possible end, and this hope that I claim we must have for achieving happiness might as well come about as an external motive into the way we shape our principles and actions. I think we can say that Malebranche may defend a position where this is just a regulatory idea or something we should aspire to, although we do not have actually the tools or actually the appropriate nature to achieve it at any moment of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you.
So as far as the unclear idea portion of that, to be honest, it felt, my instinct was at least to agree with you. And part of it was my attempt to understand what was going on specifically in the disclosure account, and the role of the equivocation about idea. So I think for me, it felt like there's something going on with communication that I don't fully understand. So in a way, maybe what I'm saying is, like, when I came to that portion and trying to understand that account of, or that interpretation of how we might know, or of conjecture, I felt like there's some other, like, substantial research question in play here. And to be honest, I think one that goes well beyond my own brief knowledge of or shallow knowledge of the literature, if you will. So I think the one thing I will say is it's possible, because of that I am misrepresenting the disclosure interpretation in some way, and maybe a charitable defense. Although it would be to say that whatever we learn through communication, that our knowledge of other minds is mediated that same way, whether it involves the unclear idea or something else. And I understand that saying something else isn't helpful, but I think that just, like, it that, like I said, is my attempt to understand what's going on, and it's possible that I honestly just did not even understand the disclosure interpretation with its focus on communication fully.
Thank you.
And then Garber, next question.
Thank you all for really interesting talks. I was just reflecting on some of the things that Hans was saying about the difference between our knowledge of ourselves and our knowledge of other minds. One thing you didn't talk about was our knowledge of God as knowledge of another mind, which is rather different than our knowledge of other finite minds. But certainly in the case of God, I think you did say we can't know anything about other minds that we don't know about our own. That's not true of God. We do know, for example, that God contains ideas, which are, we see all things in God. God has ideas that we don't. And in fact, there are arguments to that effect, that we may think we have ideas of things, but we're actually seeing them in God, which is an interesting difference. But but now about knowledge of other finite minds, one of the things that is different between our knowledge of ourself and our knowledge of other minds is we have a certain knowledge of our own existence. What is the status of our knowledge of other minds? It certainly is not absolute certainty. Is it a moral certainty? Is it not certainty at all?
I think that it depends at which point along the inferential chain the knowledge comes. So I think you might say that for my thought is that for certain things, like the mathematical truths and the moral truths, that it is a kind of conditional certainty. That is, if other minds exist, then these things are true of them for certain. And as you move down the progression, once you arrive at the spot with, say, if there are other embodied minds or other human embodied minds, then their mental states and experiences are mediated by the body in the same way as mine. And we still know that for certain because of the uniformity of God's action in other minds. But I think at that point, for Malebranche, as soon as the body becomes involved, as soon as there is some kind of interrelation between the body and the mind, it immediately becomes not certain at all. At best, likely.
Do we know about the existence of bodies? Oh, I think we don't know about the existence of bodies more certainly than we know about the existence of minds. I mean, famously, Malebranche says, we know about the existence of bodies through revelation.
Yeah, so that I think studying those passages when I was still thinking that the question of the existence of other minds should be a part of this initial project. I noticed that he treats the existence, I think it's in Elucidation 10, or is it, is that the, when he talks about it, he distinguishes, we don't even know that our own body exists. And so we have certain evidence for the existence of at least one non-divine mind. And so that was around the point where I started to think this is a separate project about the existence of other minds. But I do think that there is a difference for him in the question about the existence of bodies and the existence of other minds that comes down to we have evidence of at least one mind besides the mind of God existing. And then we don't have evidence of even our own body existing. And so I presume that the question of whether other minds exist, there's also a passage in a letter to de Marin later in life, where Malebranche criticizes Spinoza and says that his union with universal reason should convince Spinoza that God exists, his mind exists, and other minds exist. And I've not been sure, I haven't found much textual evidence. Sort of those are the two pieces of the question about other minds and their existence and what we know.
Well, he does say that Scripture gives us reason to believe in the existence of bodies. Does Scripture give us reason to believe in the existence of other minds?
I think it could in the same way. And I think so. There's another avenue of investigation that involves his account of the incarnation. So we would have some evidence there for at least one embodied mind.
Would you say Christ?
Right. But I'm still not sure. So I would say, yeah, I think yes. I think, but I think the question with the letter to de Marin or de Myron, my pronunciation is an ignorant one for certain, but that raised the question for me of whether it's divine revelation in the sense of God instructing us through Scripture that makes us certain of that other minds exist, or whether there's some other way that just through our union with divine reason we would come to know it for certain. And that, I think, those pieces of information are as far as I was able to get with it. But I do think that all else aside, Scripture attests to it in the same way.
Attest to what? To
the existence of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to throw a finger here, reminding of Daria's question about Catholicism, and just throw in the issue of Eucharist, where you have exactly the problem of mind or whatever, soul, Christ body.
Yeah. So I will admit, no idea at all whether the mind of Christ is present in the Eucharist. But to clarify my earlier answer, I think that there is biblical evidence that other minds exist in the same way as bodies. I think the question is perhaps, is there other evidence that Malebranche sees for the existence, for believing in the existence of other minds?
Well, the Eucharist, it seems to me, would, that gives you body and blood. I'm not sure that it necessarily gives you mind.
Right. Yeah.
Could I have a finger?
Yes, go ahead.
Colin, sorry. Did you have something along these lines?
I have a question for you on a different thread. Why don't you take your finger?
Okay. I'm wondering whether there's an argument from creation for other minds. Would a creation of just my mind and God's properly? Well, there'd have to be Christ's mind. You have to have the incarnation, otherwise the world is not worthy of creation in the first place. So we have three, but I wonder whether that's going to be enough enough to glorify God, just my mind. So you might have an indirect argument from the perfection of creation or glorification of God through creation that there have to be other minds. In the case of bodies, I was going to just say elucidation 6 is the one I'm thinking about. And there, I don't think with respect to the perfection of creation, you need bodies. But I do think you need other minds. So there might be a difference there. This is something I don't have direct text where Malebranche says this, but it seems to me as an argument here in the case of minds that he doesn't necessarily have in the case of bodies. And he has to go for, faith in the Scriptures being the route to prove that they're bodies.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I actually think that maybe it's loose, perhaps. One of the analogical interpretations when it's discussing the question of the existence of other minds makes an argument based on the order of perfections.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm wondering whether there's some, again, that's not going to be a direct argument, but through God's perfection.
Yeah.
And through him having to have a motive for creation, you might have an argument there for other minds. I still think you wouldn't have an argument for bodies on that.
Right. Yeah, I do think that there's a really clear difference between them. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Colin?
Thanks. This is kind of a question for Tad and Hans, so you can do with it what you will. And I just want to like stand up for the idea that there might be a kind of like unclear or incomplete idea of the mind that we have access to. So like obviously like there's the archetype of body and we have like awesome access to that. And our relationship to minds is like totally inferior. So I think that's where your pushback is coming from. But then I think about Malebranche's discussions of the relations of perfection, where he says that you can just kind of consult order and tell that like a mind is superior to body, that like your coachman is superior to a stone. And like, I don't really understand how you could have, access to those kinds of relations of perfection if there's like something kind of in the mind slot of that relation. So like, even if it fits awkwardly with other things Malebranche says, I kind of feel like he is appealing to some kind of idea of the mind that is like built into order that we have epistemic access to. So I'm wondering how you kind of like negotiate with those passages.
So Hans, you want to go first? You're the speaker.
Sure. Although I think that I think the main thing that I would say, I don't know that I have a good response to that. I think that there is clearly something that is happening when we communicate. So if it seems clear that we are able to communicate about sensations that we've had with other people who've had similar sensations. And if communication is turning the other person's, like turning both of our minds toward the same idea in the mind of God, I think the question is what are we turning toward when we are talking about our experiences? And I guess that it's possible that we could both be isolated and be thinking only of our own experience of that thing. And that, so in a way, we would sort of circumvent the idea of another mind or of a mind, and instead we would only be thinking about the experience itself. So when we both turn toward the experience of having our hand burned by holding it too close to the fire, we're both just thinking like isolated in our own like separate unions with the mind of God. We're thinking of, oh, that time I burned my hand, and there isn't a sort of an archetypal hand burning idea. I think that's like off the cuff. That's as close as I could get to explaining it without an idea.
So yeah, so I think what we get through consciousness would be enough to know that our mind is superior to the body. So we would compare what we get through consciousness to the idea that we have through seeing God, body of extension. And we would see that mind has certain perfections that we're immediately aware of that body lacks. So in God's case, God sees the perfections through the ideas, right? He has an idea of our mind, he has an idea of body. He can just compare the ideas and see that, minds are superior to bodies. Our route, I think, has to be more indirect, right? We have to compare what we see in ourselves imperfectly, which doesn't reveal our substance. It only reveals what we actual experience. But even that's going to be superior to shapes and motions and things like that. And on those grounds, we can take our minds to be more perfect. And so don't need access I think, to an idea in God to see that we're perfect. I guess that's how I try to spin it.
I have more questions, but I will resist the temptation.
We are actually closing in a minute, but Julie had a question at some point for Ellie, and I would like to close with that. Julie, if you can keep it.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, so Ellie, I think I was struck by your proposal at the end of your talk, and for better or for worse, I read Malebranche and Locke as being very similar in many ways. So this is forgive me for thinking about Locke. The proposal, if I understood it correctly, was that we sort of kind of recognize God as the general good and sort of choose to love God kind of on the basis of our sort of rational ideas about God's superiority or something like that. And that sounds very much to me like how Locke describes our decisions about long-term goals for ourselves and like building the kind of the right sort of uneasiness for those goals. If I understood your proposal correctly, it seems in tension with one of the ways that I've kind of often understood the way that Malebranche thinks about our love of God. So one of the things that it seems to me connected to the recommendation to mortify the senses and to become like the dead is that when everything around us is quiet, then we can actually feel God. So it seemed to, I always sort of thought that Malebranche might have thought that like loving God for God's perfection was something that happens when we eliminate, like it's sort of an elimination process, when we eliminate the things that are distracting us. I always think of it as like music, like if there's a very sort of quiet music playing and your neighbor is playing like EDM with a big bass amp or something, right? You can't hear the quiet music until everything else has, or you can't, until everything that's noisy is eliminated. And that seems like a very different model from what you're proposing, or maybe they're complementary, I'm not really sure. So, I mean, how do you sort of understand the natural inclination towards God that's always there in parallel or in conjunction with the proposal that you have, which sounds much more epistemic and sort of the process of this sort of rational kind of thinking through the order of perfection?
I love the music example. I use that, but I think they might be complementary. Yes. This process of reflection, in which we just like ignore the secondary inclinations we have to particular bodies, particular objects, and we just like focus for a moment on the general inclination, is something that might need some kind of silence, as you described it. I didn't think of it to the moment, but it's something. Just my proposal is that this is a process of reflection that may very much be easier to do if you're not compelled to attend to other to actual objects in the world. So thank you. Works very well.
Right. Thank you all. Thank you all the speakers. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Very nice section. So very nice session. And join us next week for the last installment of the summer series of the Princeton-Bucharest seminar. Until then, have a nice